It was a very, very big explosion. Killed 200 people. Personally, I lost a cousin who was 53 years old, having a cafe in a place overseeing the port, which is due to the incapacity of the governments we have had to take in hand the well-being of the Lebanese people. Not always democracy is the right solution. Some countries need dictatorship. Look at Iraq. Were we not better under Saddam Hussein than we are today, and having the US invading, having some of their people killed? We were better under Gaddafi, whom I don't like, but the country was better. Look at the mess they are in now in Libya. It has to be a wise and good dictatorship, if possible. Forced democracy, like what the Americans ask us to be, to follow their model, is not always the right solution for everyone.
Ahlan wa sahlan, it's Keybros. Welcome to a new episode of SOFTtalk, where unlike BBC's Hard Talk, the interviewees won't find it hard to talk. So today, we're very honored to have a guest from Lebanon. He actually comes from a very influential and powerful political family in Lebanon, and in fact, his grandfather has helped Lebanon to join the United Nations back in 1945. So Jacques, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
My name is Jacques Naim. I am born in Lebanon in 1947. I come from a family of politicians. My grandfather's name was Wadi Naim. He was, in 1945, Minister of Interior and of Education, and he was the head of the Lebanese delegation that signed the United Nations Charter in San Francisco. My uncle, Edmond Naim, was dean of the law faculty at the Lebanese University and became a governor of the central bank in 1985. My father was a member of parliament. He was a minister of social affairs in 1974. My best school friend was Bashir Gemayel, who was elected president of the Republic in 1982. And was killed 3 weeks later by an explosion on September 14th, 1982. My involvement in politics ended then. Now I am mostly in Italy, where I've been living for 25 years with my family. I follow Lebanese information on a daily basis, and I'm connected with my mother, who's 95 and who is in Lebanon as well. This is the flag of Lebanon, you know, the cedar, which I have here with me. Myself, I went to Hong Kong the first time in 1972, so that was a very long time ago. I've been coming back to Hong Kong since at least a couple of times a year.
Thank you very much. Let's start with the first question now. So what is your view on the Hong Kong protests last year?
I have a very pragmatic view on violence anywhere in the world. I am against violence in general, but in some cases it was useful in the history of humanity anyway. I don't think the violence can bring anything to the Hong Kong demonstrators. They are more now going into ideological thinking and not thinking too much about the reality of the situation, which is 1997 return of Hong Kong to China. It's wiser to negotiate and to talk rather than to do, violent demonstrations. Not always democracy is the right solution. Some countries need dictatorship. Look at Iraq. Were we not better under Saddam Hussein than we are today, and having the US invading, having some of their people killed? We were better under Gaddafi, whom I don't like, but the country was better. Look at the mess they are in now in Libya. It has to be a wise and good dictatorship, if possible. Forced democracy, like what the Americans ask us to be, to follow their model, is not always the right solution for everyone.
How did the media back in Lebanon report on the protests? And also, how do the people in your country see the protests in general?
In Lebanese newspaper, their demonstrations were reported in the international section in a constant way. We were very interested in what's going on in Hong Kong, especially that it's linked to China, with whom Lebanon has very different interests, most of them in discussion. People in our country, I must say, being preoccupied by major issues about their everyday life. Probably in the last year, we've seen less reporting about the demonstration. But when they started, certainly, especially when they were violent, reports were in the newspapers, absolutely.
Lebanon is one of the 53 countries that officially supported the enactment of the controversial Hong Kong National Security Law in the United Nations Human Rights Council. So what is your view on the law? Do you think it is necessary?
The security law is necessary. It could prevent domestic violence because sometimes people that are violent need some strength to be brought back into the right line of being a member of Hong Kong. Hong Kong needs to be back to stability. Any country would do it in its own land. They are taking positions that defend their sovereignty in a way, because Hong Kong, at the end, is part of China. We cannot say that it's not part of China. The Chinese government is, of course, much stronger than anything that can happen in Hong Kong. They have been using until now their strength in a very, let's say, cautious way. There has not been any invasion of Hong Kong. They could do in 24 hours, you know. So it won't take more than that for them to be everywhere in Hong Kong.
The capital of Lebanon, Beirut, recently experienced a horrifying explosion of ammonium nitrate that caused at least 200 deaths and more than 7,000 injuries. Now, first of all, I'd like to extend my fullest condolences to your people. And so how is the situation now in Beirut? Are the people getting back to their normal lives?
Lebanon has been in a very bad situation for over a year and a half on a financial point of view. We are, unfortunately, with a very weak government and very weak president of the republic. So the explosion was really based on a lack of following the problems that Lebanon has by receiving this 2,700 tons of ammonium nitrate that exploded. Those arrived in 2014 on a Moldovan vessel that was coming from Batumi in Georgia and was meant to go to Mozambique. They were stopped in Lebanon. The official reason was the boat was not, in a good condition and needed to be fixed. The owner was not paying the charges that were due to the Lebanese port. And as a consequence, they seized the goods that were on that vessel and they put them in a warehouse. They were left there for 6 years. Many officials asked the government to do what's necessary to have them retrieved from there because they were a danger. Beirut port is really in the center of Beirut. Everything from centuries was built around the Beirut port and grew from there, essentially. Ammonium nitrate to explode needs fire. Some people say that they were fireworks. Some people say that they were working to fix the doors of this warehouse. Fire was sparkling from the material they were using. There are many different interpretations. There was a small explosion to start, which again, we don't know where it comes from. And that small explosion had a bigger explosion going after it. People said it's the third or fourth biggest explosion that happened in the world. It was a very, very big explosion. Everyone that was around there, including some firemen, other that were working around, and other that were only innocent people staying in their homes that gave towards the port. Explosion killed 200 people, more than 7,000 wounded, because the explosion broke the glasses of everything that was like 2-3 kilometers from the port. Around 300,000 people were homeless after the explosion. So they had to go to other places until their house was reconstructed. Personally, I lost a cousin who was 53 years old, having a cafe in a place overseeing the port. When the first explosion happened, his friend told him, let's go out. My cousin went to look outside and to see what was going on because he was curious and no one knew that there was going to be a second, more stronger explosion. So he went forward and the second explosion happened. He had an internal hemorrhage and then passed away on his way to the hospital. My mother's house, which is like 5-6 kilometers away from the port, had its windows, broken. That explosion, which is due to the incapacity of the governments we have had not only now, but also for years past, to take in hand the well-being of the Lebanese people. Let it be from Najib Mikati to Saad Hariri, and they're unable to form a new government. We have, unfortunately, a weak and corrupted group at the head of the state. They don't hide their corruption, and they steal the money of the population. But Lebanese banks are unable to give you your own money. All what you have saved for years in your life, you cannot take back. You can take it in small pieces because the banks are bankrupt. The governor of the central bank failed in managing the situation. It's a person I know. My uncle, when he was governor of the central bank, and he was in a situation where the state was asking him for money, were unjustified, he did not give it to the state. He opposed that. We had a minister of interior who wanted to print new passports. And my uncle discovered that he was asking for much more money than the cost of printing passport. So he did not accept to pay because the central bank is the bank of the state. And he found where to print the passport at a much lower cost. The Minister of Interior sent soldiers to bring my uncle out of the central bank. He was in the middle of a meeting. The soldier pulled him by his feet, dragged him out of the central bank. And he shouted to his guards, "Don't let them take me." The guards fired, on the windows of the central bank that all crashed down, the barrier between my uncle who was inside and those who wanted to take him outside. Everyone records that in Lebanon. Today, the situation is still bad because international help to Lebanon does not want to go through the government, which makes things more difficult because how to manage that? International help is coming to individual organizations or even helping to rebuild directly houses that have been destroyed. Saad Hariri, who is the named prime minister. But we have had our experience with Saad Hariri. He failed, and we've had him for too many years. It's time for him to leave.
Lebanon has enjoyed a very positive relationship with China. It is officially part of China's Belt and Road Initiative. And in fact, the Beirut port was an important part of the initiative before it was tragically blown up. Lebanon also continues to use Huawei despite concerns from Western countries. What is your view on Lebanon-China relations? Do you think the BRI can help your country in the long term?
China arrives at the right moment, and China should take advantage of this moment. The Belt and Road is a huge project. It's something very, very impressive that President Xi started. It's probably the biggest project in the world now. I think it still can be, still is part of the project. China can help with not much money to rebuild that. They started invested in Lebanon on some infrastructure, a conservatory that costs about $63 million, which is very, very good. But China doesn't do enough to show in Lebanon what they're doing and what they can do. Having already been close to Iran and with big projects in Iran that are happening now, which brings a counterweight to the US-Israeli position. I'm not against the presence of Israel. It's trying to have peace with most of the Arab countries, but it should give also some solution to the Palestinian problem. We have now the China, Russia on one side and USA, Israel on the other side. China should have more Lebanese people with them. The fact they are in good relation with Iran, who is playing a big role in Lebanon. Hezbollah exists. If we want it or not, this is a fact. Hezbollah is a big ally of Iran and of Syria. This is not the best situation, but it's realpolitik. We have to accept this reality. China being in good relation with Iran could play a major role in keeping Hezbollah quiet. We don't need weapons in Lebanon. All parties left their weapons except Hezbollah because it's resistance against Israel. But they've been using it very, very little against Israel. They've been using it more to build up the power of other countries like Syria. As you know, Lebanese are divided in different confessions. We have the Maronites, who are Christian Catholics at the top, but they have little power because they gave up their power in the Taif agreement 30 years ago. This agreement brought us to the situation where we are. You have to have somebody that makes the final decision. President of the parliament has more power than the president of the republic. We need to be more efficient. Major change should happen in Lebanon. China can contribute to this because China has the strength and it's the right moment. It's now they have to do it. Now. They should not wait for the government to give them the agreement. By bringing help to Lebanon, they are opening the Belt and Road to be able to use the Beirut port to open towards Europe.
The tensions between the US and China have been growing lately. Unlike Israel and most countries in Europe, Lebanon is more seen as an important ally of China. If US were to hypothetically go to war with China, obviously I don't hope that happen, which side will people in Lebanon be more likely to side with?
I would say today the majority of Lebanese would range with China. The US and Israel have been bringing a lot of destruction and pain to the Lebanese people. Hezbollah exists because Israel invaded Lebanon. That's when it started. I would say nowadays, if you take a vote in Lebanon, because after all, we are a democracy, you would have a majority ranging with China rather than with the US. It is true that US have had a very particular president for the past 4 years. He made a lot of disasters and he changed his mind every 5 minutes. He's been a businessman and a showman doing a very famous show that was called The Apprentice, where the only word he knows and he used to say is, "You're fired." He fired so many people that were against or giving him advice that he did not like.
So Lebanon is trapped in a proxy war between Saudi Arabia, leader of the Sunni world, and also Iran, leader of the Shia world. It has also engaged in many long conflicts with Israel. In fact, international visitors with proof of having been to Israel may be denied entry into Lebanon. So which side of the Middle East conflict will Lebanon prefer to stand on? And also, do you think the conflict with Israel can be resolved in the future?
It is true that in Lebanon, since the presence of Hezbollah, the weight between the Sunni who preside to the government and the Shiite who preside to the parliament has changed. The Shiites now are stronger than the Sunni, probably as well in numbers. Now there are changes also in Saudi Arabia that we have to realize. There is a young crown prince. It's a royalty that comes by brothers. Now that all the brothers have gone, it's going to the first child of the current king, which is MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. He has his view. He wants to change the situation in Saudi Arabia and in the Arab world. He's been taking decisions, sometimes good, sometimes bad for Lebanon. He's been with and against Saad Hariri, who has the double nationality of Saudi Arabia and of Lebanon, like his father. He had Saad Hariri arrested and stating his resignation as president of the Lebanese government from Riyadh, under pressure from the government of Saudi Arabia and essentially from MBS. The situation in Lebanon is very delicate now. Israel, of course, plays a major role. Look to who profits the crime. This is a French saying, à qui profite le crime. Most of the time, the crime has been profiting to Israel. Even the Lebanese, the explosion of August 4th. Destroying Lebanon is to the advantage of Israel. Beirut being the financial capital of the Middle East. We're not anymore. Everything has been destroyed. And this is smart, but it would be smarter if instead of destroying, they would be building. Every now and then they bombard some areas in Lebanon, in Syria. This is a war by proxy that the US is doing against many in the region, essentially against Iran. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, and a president who was close to Israel. And he was my friend. His name was Bashir Gemayel, and he was killed. His brother, who was elected president after him, started by accepting a peace treaty with Israel and then withdrew of it. They were not equal. One had much better visions of the future. I'm going to tell you what Bashir Gemayel wanted to do of Lebanon. He wanted to have Lebanon as an American military base, because Lebanon by itself could not save Lebanon and defend Lebanon. That was not in favor of everybody. And they were trying to force him to recognize Israel. And he refused. He told the Prime Minister of Israel then, in a meeting they've had, secret meeting, and I met him just after the meeting, let me continue uniting the Lebanese, and will come the day where we will recognize and make peace with Israel. The Prime Minister refused this approach. And a few days later, Bashir was killed under the cover of a person that was working and for Israel and for Syria. We have doubts about why he was killed and by whom until today. Can it be solved one day? Probably it will. When? I don't know.
Due to the Syrian civil war, Lebanon has received over 1 million refugees from Syria, which has further worsened the already tough economic situation in your country. So how does Lebanon view these Syrian refugees? Do you think that they should be sent back to Syria?
Before the arrival of the Assad family, the presidency of Syria, we had very good relations. And then with time, it deteriorated because Syria wanted to take back Lebanon. Let's not forget that 100 years ago, the French colony of Lebanon became independent. The French created Lebanon essentially for the Christians. It was the only country in the Middle East that had a kind of majority of Christians, which is not the case anymore today. The demography has changed. Syria had always an eye on Lebanon. They were jealous of Lebanon. This is what they tried to do. They could not do it because Lebanese resisted. And there was a big war. I'm a witness of that war. The bombs falling on Beirut, I saw them with my eyes. We fought the Syrian presence of Lebanon and we confirmed our independence. From 82, they started withdrawing from the centers of Beirut and they were only on the borders. When the war started in Syria, Lebanon received 1.5 million refugees. We already had 500,000 Palestinians refugees that started coming in 1967 after the famous Six-Day War. Lebanon could not say no, but it was a very big weight on Lebanon's shoulders because Lebanon is about 4.5 million people. To receive 1.5 million plus 500,000, which is 2 million in total refugees, is a weight that was very, very heavy on our shoulders. We received a lot of help from different organizations in the world, but those refugees, of course, they want, most of them, to go back to their house, to their country. Some will not want to go back because they feel more freedom in Lebanon. Until the Assad regime changes, which is not foreseen in the near future, people will want to stay outside. Syria is weak now. It's been helped by very different countries that are bombing different places. You have the US bombing, you have the Russian bombing, you have the Turkish bombing, you have the Israelis bombing, and you wonder if they don't talk to each other to decide who bombs what and where.
Lastly, Lebanon has a very complicated and divided internal political and religious landscape. Given these hostile conditions, how do you think your country can resolve these divisions and move on to a progressive future?
It's not a merit selection of who should be in the different positions in the government. It is based on religion, and that does not help. Meaning you can be the first in an exam, but if you are not of the right religion, you will not access that position. They will take number 15 because he is of the religion that is needed in that position. Until this is changed, we cannot move forward. It is unfair to say that the President of the Republic must always be Maronite. We can have a better President of the Republic than what we have now. He could be Sunni, he could be Shia. Better to have people that really on a merit base and not on a religious base. This is the only way we can save our country.
Shukran. Thank you once again to Jacques for coming on to our show. I hope your country can recover from the past conflict and also move towards a better future. This is the end of today's episode. If you like this video, please again remember to give a thumbs up. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.